Hello, and thank you for clicking on our video, From America to Palestine, Climate, Colonialism, and Conservation, an event hosted by us, the Pacific Workers Collective, in collaboration with the International Solidarity Movement. While the event was wildly successful, we did run into a few audio issues during the beginning of the live stream. To remedy this, we've asked our first speaker to reproduce the affected sections of her presentation. With that, let's move on to the event.
Hello, everybody. Glad to see everybody here. Welcome to America to Palestine, Climate, Colonialism, and Conservation. My name is Scarlett, and I'm pleased to see everybody here. This is great. I am with the Pacific Workers Collective, and this is our debut event. We are a group of progressives dedicated to making meaningful change through education and community action in the Pacific Northwest. We strongly believe in anti-colonialism and environmentalism. We are excited to present our panel. Our first speaker, Shelby, is a disabled mixed indigenous scientist who grew up on the prairies of Montana and currently lives in the Bitterroot Valley. Shelby is Pembina Ojibwe, Irish, French, Serbian, and a member of the Aani Nation. She will draw connections between the ongoing genocide of Native Americans here and the parallels we are witnessing in occupied Palestine. Our second and third speakers, Ben and Cassidy, are experts on climate change and biology, respectively, and will speak on the devastating environmental impacts of the Israeli occupation. Our fourth speaker, Rebecca, will present a firsthand account of the West Bank. She traveled there with the International Solidarity Movement, or ISM, for their most recent protective presence trip and has personal experience with the Israeli settler colonialist state. Our fifth speaker, Kate, will discuss the logistics of volunteering for the Protective Presence Delegation. So before we go any further, I must acknowledge that we are on the stolen lands of the Lutchute speaking First people of Seattle. In this acknowledgement, we as an organization name our positions as uninvited guests on this land and are firm that justice has not been done by the rightful people of this land until it has been rematriated to them. We are settlers on unceded territory gained through the unlawful breaking of the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855. We state this land acknowledgement in part to make salient the ongoing project of settler colonialism on this land and around the world. This is why we are excited to offer the opportunity to join us in the international fight against settler colonialism. We are in collaboration with ISM to send a Pacific Northwest Protective Presence Delegation to the West Bank in the community of Masafer Yada, which will be occurring during the upcoming fall olive harvest. We invite you to join the delegation, and we will provide more information on how to do so. If you are not able to make this commitment yourself but still wish to contribute, consider donating to our fundraiser through Joining Hands for Justice to assist with travel costs for those able to join the delegation. We also have a few dozen baby cedar trees that are available for purchase, and all proceeds will be going to the travel fund. Additionally, we encourage you to sign up to volunteer for conservation work through the Snoqualmie Tribe's Environmental and Natural Resources Department on May 17th. We have brochures available also about real rent provided by the Duwamish Solidarity Group. We will provide more details after the panel for some of these. So as a reminder, after the panel, there will be a Q&A section with both live and online audience. Please do not be afraid to step up and ask. We welcome all questions. The Pacific Workers Collective would like to thank ISM, Seattle DSA, 350 Seattle, Apples Against Apartheid, No Tech for Apartheid, Extinction Rebellion Seattle, and Jewish Voice for Peace Seattle for helping us make this event happen. Alrighty. So with that, thank you. I'm going to pass it off to our first speaker, Shelby.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today on this gorgeous day. As Scarlett mentioned, my name's Shelby, and I'm going to be giving a talk about settler colonialism in Palestine and Turtle Island. So, first, I'll give a brief introduction about myself, just kind of who I am, where I come from, and my personal experiences with settler colonialism. Then I'll briefly go into the history of solidarity between the indigenous people of North America and Palestine. There's a shared history there, and so I just want to briefly talk about it to, kind of explain how these two issues that might not seem related are actually extremely related. And then I'll go into defining what settler colonialism is to set up the framework to then talk about the rest of our kind of shared history of occupation. And I'll give specific examples from North America, mostly the United States, as this talk says, and then Palestine. As Scarlett mentioned, I grew up on the prairies of eastern Montana. Specifically, I was raised on a cattle ranch on the Fort Belknap Reservation, which is my tribe's res. And coincidentally, it was also home to the last herd of buffalo in the continental United States, between the Bear Paw Mountains and the Little Rocky Mountains in the Milk River Valley. And I'll go into a little bit later why it was the last herd of buffalo and kind of what happened to the buffalo. So we'll get into that a bit later. But for here, I wanted to include some my personal experiences with settler colonialism. And I also wanted to say that, right, settler colonialism, I think we kind of pretend it's in the past. It's not, we act like it's not something that still occurs today. And so I wanted to include some examples of how settler colonialism is alive and well today. So one of those examples is so when we sold our land, or when we were kind of forced onto reservations, in treaties, the United States government is obligated to provide health care. That was one of our conditions for kind of surrendering our land by force. Was we were supposed to receive health care in perpetuity. And the way that happens is we have IHS, right, Indian Health Services. And the budget for that is decided entirely by the federal government. We have no say in it. And kind of because of that, we have the worst healthcare in the country. We do not get enough money for our needs. And additionally, as soon as you leave the reservation, you don't have access to it. Like, you have to be physically on the res, or like located near enough that you can drive to receive services. Otherwise, you don't have access to it, even though, like I said, it's in treaty rights. We have a right to health care provided by the federal government. But somehow it's a loophole. When you leave the reservation, you are no longer somehow entitled to receive free health care. Another example is tribal nations don't have access to their water unless they use it, and I'm quoting the law here, unless they use it in a civilized manner. So that right there is an example how, even though in treaties we're supposed to have water access, right? Access to water, and not just water, but we should be able to control what happens to our water. And according to the United States Constitution, right, treaties are the law of the land. And yet somehow the American government has put restrictions on how we can use that. So most often, using our water in a civilized manner translates to using it for capitalism, right? Extracting resources from the land. So a tribal nation can't just say that they want their waters clean and free moving to nourish the people, the land, the animals. That's not enough. We have to use it in a way that our colonizers approve of, right? In a civilized manner. So that is just another example of how, right, even though in treaties we have rights to our water, we cannot use them unless the white people occupying our land approve of it, right? And so, as I just wanted to say that these are two examples of really hundreds I could include that demonstrate that on reservations today, settler colonialism is still active and affects our daily life, really. And another personal experience with settler colonialism is I remember growing up listening to my grandmother, my aunts and my father talking about the fight to get our tribe, the Little Shell Chippewa tribe, federally recognized. And the reason we hadn't been federally recognized before that is because our chief refused to sell our land for pennies an acre. He knew what our land was worth, and he knew that white settlers in the area that had less fertile land, so less quality land, sold for dollars an acre, and the U.S. government was offering us pennies, and so he refused to sign. And then after that, the United States government decided they were no longer signing treaties with indigenous people, and so at that point, if you had not signed a treaty with the United States government, you were no longer recognized as an indigenous people and therefore had no rights to land. You essentially had no land. And so in the 1950s, some families got together and there started to be a movement to fight for federal recognition of the Little Shell tribe. And my grandmother continued that fight, as I said, my family. And we finally received Montana state recognition in 2000. And it took another 20 years almost for us to be federally recognized in 2019. We were the 574th tribe to be federally recognized. And the image at the top right is actually taken from the celebration we had once we finally received recognition. My cousins are actually in there dancing. It was such a fun night, but it was also absolutely absurd that it took so long. We had to meet requirements decided by the federal government. So, right, not even the federal government got to decide what constituted an indigenous tribe. With not indigenous people themselves, but the federal government. And so that right there is kind of demonstrating that indigenous people are only recognized if white people agree to it, right? If our colonizers agree to it. And then that also, we didn't just have to meet the requirements. The bill also had to be passed in Congress. And that was why there is a almost 20-year difference between state recognition and federal, is because we had to go through so much what essentially equated to bureaucratic bullshit, really, because we had to get the United States Congress to agree to pass a bill, which, as we all know, is, impossible almost. So that's another reason why it took so long. So with this slide, I wanted to talk about the history of indigenous solidarity between the indigenous people of North America, specifically the United States, and the indigenous people of Palestine. So the history of our solidarity goes back to the 1960s, 70s, starting with the American Indian movement. When the American Indian movement was forming, it actually look to organizations like the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Irish Republic Army when they were developing their kind of resistant movement and their materials. They looked to people that they recognized a shared history of oppression, right, of colonization. And additionally, during the 1970s, Palestinians would attend powwows in groups to show solidarity. They were a constant presence at Standing Rock, specifically the Palestinian youth movement during the No DAPL protests that were taking place at Standing Rock. The Palestinian youth movement kind of had a constant delegation that was there and present at Standing Rock. And that relationship was also reciprocal. So then later, once Gaza now in 2023 is under this much more intensified ethnic cleansing and kind of genocidal project, former water protectors from the No DAPL movement actually came out to help organize with the Palestinian youth movement and also help to attend their demonstrations in groups. So just an example of how right? Indigenous peoples from both of these places have recognized a shared history of colonization, a shared history of oppression, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. They have recognized in each other a shared history. An example of this is at the No Dapple movement, a Palestinian comrade, while visiting the Osheti Shakowin camp at Standing Rock, said, "I see it as an intifada on the plains, as an uprising against the same occupier." And so that just shows, right, that we are recognizing a shared history, and again, just demonstrating the reciprocity of this relationship. This image on the left here is an indigenous delegation that went to Gaza to be a protective presence. Actually, they went to the West Bank. I'm sorry, they went to the West Bank to be a protective presence during the olive harvest. And so, just as I said, right, these we have a long history going back decades of solidarity, and so while, like I said, these issues may not seem related, they are actually very connected because our struggle is a shared struggle of resistance to settler colonialism, and these images are just some examples of that shared history and the solidarity we feel. So I mentioned how I was going to define settler colonialism. And so I think these images are going to do a really helpful job of kind of demonstrating the difference between what is kind of generically colonialism and what the very specific type of colonialism that settler colonialism is. And so on the left are examples of colonialism that, hopefully from history, we'll know a bit about. It won't be hopefully too much of a kind of out of left field intro for everybody. And so the main difference, so on the left, these examples, on the top left is of a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. And so here, colonialism is kind of generally described as systems and practices that seek to impose the will of one people on another and to use the resources of the colonized people for the benefit of the colonizer. And so I think these images, as I said, demonstrate that, where this sugar plantation, they're using the local indigenous people to as a labor force, right? So they're extracting labor from the indigenous people and forcing them to extract from the land as well. So it's more as an extractive colonialism, right? That they're extracting labor and they're extracting from the land. And the bottom picture is another example of that. This is of the ivory trade in Africa, where again, the indigenous people, the Africans, were extracted for their labor, right? They were sent to go collect ivory, which equated to kind of killing elephants for their ivory. And it was not for the benefit of the local populations, but as you can see, of their white colonizers. Another example is the rubber trade in Africa, right, where Africans were given certain quotas of rubber they were supposed to collect a day, and if they didn't, they chopped off hands and feet as punishment. And so the difference between settler colonialism and colonialism is colonialism, colonizers are going there to extract from the land. They're going there to extract resources, right? Labor and money that is from the land. Whereas settler colonialism is a system where settlers come to settle the land. Their intent is to take land from indigenous people and forcibly remove, and oftentimes it's a genocidal structure. So a good example, as I said, the top image is from the Australian frontier wars. And so as we can see, this occupying army comes in and is killing the indigenous people with the intent to take their land. And so settler colonialism is kind of described as like a system of erasure. Like they are erasing the indigenous people, they are supplanting the indigenous people. The bottom image is of settlers arriving to Canada, and again, this image I think kind of shows, right, they're arriving in these big ships with all of their all of their belongings with them. And it clearly demonstrates that their intent is to stay. Their intent is to come and settle this, what is to them, new land. And in order to settle new land, you have to first ethnically cleanse the indigenous populations there. And so that is kind of a key difference, as I'm saying, between colonialism and settler colonialism. One is more extractive in nature, whereas the other one is more genocidal in nature and is more focused on taking land, often by force. And so specifically, this is just, we're familiar with settler colonialism, right, in the United States, right, manifest destiny. And so just another image to kind of give us a visual representation of what it means to take somebody else's land, like land that is already occupied. It is not a peaceful process. It is done through violent removal that often ends in genocide. Cool. And so I thought it would be helpful to have a visual representation of settler colonialism, and specifically with the loss of land. And so up here are some modern day examples of settler colonial states that are still existing. On the left is Canada, in the middle is Australia, and on the right is New Zealand. And each of these maps, they're laid out where the top left frame is towards the start of colonization, and you'll see, right, the land that's in bold is land that's controlled by indigenous people. And you'll see as colonization progresses, right, as it gets further in history, that land that is controlled and occupied by indigenous people gets smaller and smaller until it's a tiny fraction of what they had. And so specifically, right, for what we're here today to talk about, these are United States and Palestine. And so again, it's just showing that same timeline where as colonization progresses, as more and more settlers arrive and take more land, the indigenous people are put into smaller and smaller places. In the United States, right, we have a long history of settler colonialism, so long that people pretend it's in the past and not still happening. And so a near 500 years history of that, whereas Palestine, it's, I think, just now in its 110, something like that, year of occupation. And so it's not quite in the tiny percentages as it is United States or Canada, but as we can see, it's very much on the way there. It's fitting the same pattern of indigenous people losing land to settlers. And so I wanted to talk about kind of how this happens, because right, it's kind of against human nature, or at least I hope so, to murder your neighbor and steal their house, right? Like, I think that would feel bad to do. And so people have to find a way to justify these actions, right? And so in the United States, at least, the way that both morally and legally it was justified was manifest destiny. Hopefully we learned about that in the United States history classes, right? This image kind of perfectly encapsulates that idea. This painting is supposed to represent American progress. And you'll see, like, where, right, this angelic white creature is kind of moving in to civilize the land. And that includes bringing in like rail lines, telegraph lines, the plow, right? Their farming methods, their livestock. And you can see right then on the left, moving into darkness is the indigenous populations, the wildlife, the buffalo herds. And so that's a very clear kind of representation of what they thought they were doing, right, was civilizing the land. And so manifest destiny is based on the doctrine of discovery, which was a papal bull issued in the 1400s that basically enshrined the right of Christian peoples to any other occupied land as long as they were non-Christians. They believed that they had the religious right, the call to God, to colonize land and to bring people to the Christian faith. And the manifest destiny is so tied to the doctrine of discovery that it's actually mentioned in a legal case in the Supreme Court. So in Johnson v. McIntosh, the doctrine of discovery is referenced as a justification for, like a legal justification for the theft of land in the United States. So these themes are very closely tied. And Zionism is often referred to like the cousin of manifest destiny, right? Where it still has those same ideas of white supremacy and colonization, just with Judaism slapped on the side. But they both come from the same religious fanaticism, where they believe they have a God-given right to the land. And so, where again, right, you need to come up with justifications, reasons why it's okay to steal people's lands. And so that starts with how settler leaders kind of refer to indigenous people. Very often there's themes of dehumanization. And so just to include some references from leaders in the United States and Israel. Here's a military general saying that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. George Washington referred to Indians as wolves and beasts of prey. See, a direct dehumanizing quote, right? And that kind of corresponds to the Israeli deputy defense minister calling, just straight up saying that Palestinians are beasts. They are not human. In the Declaration of Independence, natives are referred to as merciless Indian savages, right? A founding document of our country. And that continues, right, with Israeli Minister of Justice referring to Palestinians as snakes. Benjamin Netanyahu directly saying, you know, it's a struggle between the children of the light and children of darkness. This pattern of dehumanizing the indigenous peoples as a way to justify the violence that is being done to them. And so here are some examples of, well, so I know, right, people try to justify, as we're talking about, they try to justify taking land. And so I think later when we look back on history, we'll say, well, that wasn't their intent. They didn't realize what they were doing. And so I felt it was important to include leaders of like these different settler states directly saying what their intent was. And so we'll see, right, David Ben-Gurion, founding father of Israel, saying directly, we must expel the Arabs and take their place. Jabotinsky, the founder of what would later become the IDF, saying directly, right, natives have always resisted the colonists. So again, admitting that they would need to go in and do this against their will. Andrew Jackson saying that indigenous people in the United States can't flourish in the midst of a civilized community as a way to justify the removal of the natives from their homelands. And President Jackson, again, he gave a message to Congress where he is celebrating the removal of Indians beyond the white settlements. And so these are just examples of military leaders or settler leaders directly admitting that they were in a land that was already occupied and their intent was explicitly to remove those people from that land. And so here are some quotes about the military violence as a way that they justified the kind of disproportionate response of their states. And so again, right, another U.S. military general saying, the only good Indians I ever saw were dead. Natives in California were often told that destiny had awarded California to the Americans to develop, and that if the Indians got in the way, if they interfered with progress, they should be pushed aside. Just again, justifying and saying what they were going to do. And then also like justifying their disproportionate response that Thomas Jefferson saying that if they kill some of us, we shall destroy them all. Israeli defense minister stating that those who are against us, we must pick up an axe and cut off his head. that like the question of armed forces is what Zionism, is what a settler state relies on, right? The importance. And they knew it from the start. And this is just, again, like stating that they knew all along what they were doing and what their settler state was doing, and that they needed their military to be able to accomplish it, because people don't just choose to leave the land that they're born on, the land that sustains them. And so now I wanted to show how, like, right, that kind of pattern of dehumanization, of justifying your actions, how that turns into actual violence against the indigenous people, how that happens in actual policy. And so on the left is an example of the olive tree destruction by the Israeli government and settlers. Since 1967, over 1 million olive and fruit trees have been destroyed in occupied Palestine. And I wanted to include a quote from a Palestinian person saying, like, directly comparing I'm so sorry. He's stating that the destruction of their olive trees is equivalent to them just killing them, because they so heavily rely on olive trees to sustain their life. And this pattern also was in the United States. On the right is a pile of buffalo skulls. And so during the 19th century, settlers and the United States military killed about 50 million bison. And they did that with the explicit intent of starving out the natives, of destroying the ways that they were currently living, destroying their traditional way of life, to make them more malleable to the United States government, right? To make them weak enough to be forcibly pushed from their land. And that was always the intent. And so here's an example of other policies. So the left is an article in a United States paper advertising Indian land for sale. And on the right is, I got this from an Israeli human rights organization. And so this is Israelis describing their own policy in the West Bank. So this is ours in this too. I think pretty accurately describes it. And just, I wanted to include that this is also like happening in current day as well. As I said, I think we in America like to pretend that settler colonialism is a thing of the past. But as the No DAPL protest movement shows, that's kind of stuff, the theft of land, especially now through eminent domain or by being designated as waste zones, like that is still happening currently. And then also in Gaza, it's still happening, right, where underneath the ruins of the recent bombings, real estate companies in Israel are selling land already. So a key component of settler colonialism is settler violence. Settlers are often referred to as the foot soldiers of the colonial state, because not only do they participate in the theft of land by actively occupying stolen land, but they also often participate in the violent removal of indigenous people from that land. And so on the left are some examples of settler violence in Native American history, right, where settlers would just come in and murder a whole tribe or a whole population village for their land. And then I wanted to include that quote at the bottom to show that, right, so the quote says, "The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to 200 for every redskin sent to purgatory. The sum is more than all the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River are worth." Just to explain that settler violence is directly correlated to state violence, and settler violence is often sponsored and backed up by state violence. The images on the right that are in occupied Palestine, I think, demonstrate that really well visually, where, right, you almost always see IOF soldiers in the background of settler violence, and that's because they're there to back up the settlers. They are not there to make sure the settlers do not go too far. And so just demonstrating the relationship between settler violence and state authorities. So I wanted to talk about some common forms of violence, like state violence that it happens during settler colonialism. So as I mentioned, right, the removal and the erasure of the indigenous population is one of the foremost tenets of settler colonialism. And so in the United States, hopefully something we're all familiar with is the Trail of Tears, which is an example of the forced removal of indigenous people. And then on the right, whereas the U.S. cavalry just comes in and murders an entire village. So there's different forms of forceful removal. And then, like I mentioned, this is happening in current day as well. And so the pictures on the bottom, or at least two of them, are from the No DAPL protest movement, right, where those are peaceful protesters protesting a pipeline illegally operating through their territory against their will. Wherein the police and state military showed up, right, with tanks, with hundreds of officers, where they're spraying into the crowds of water protectors. And then the last picture on the right is a mass grave after the Wounded Knee massacre, where I think between 200 and 300 unarmed, mostly women and children, were murdered. And so those same themes are repeated in occupied Palestine, kind of corresponding to, I guess, an example of the Trail of Tears. Oops, sorry, thank you, Colette. No, thank you. Anyway, so this is the image on the top left is of the 1948 Nakba. So just again, as an example of a forced removal of the indigenous population. The image on the right, just to again, and the boy in the tank, to show the disproportionate response, again, that we've previously seen justifications for, that the occupying state has against the indigenous people. And then the bottom middle picture, just an example of how they're confined into smaller and smaller spaces where they don't have freedom of movement even. And then the bottom left, just to show the dehumanization of the indigenous people is really kind of encapsulated with what the military does to those indigenous populations, if that makes sense. Mass confinement, more dehumanization. And so I kind of just wanted to mention, right, that as we were mentioning, colonialism has to be justified, right? And so as Nick Estes, a Lakota historian and activist, says, colonialism is always made to look like self-defense. Invasion is always made to look like self-defense. And to kind of, again, bring it back to current day, right, that the settler colonialism of the United States or of Israel, right, the occupation has never ended. It continues to current day. People do not have a right to other people's land. Like, at the end of the day, it will never be right to kill people for a land. Cool. And so kind of to wrap it up and hopefully end on a higher, brighter note, you know, what can be done about settler colonialism? And I think this sign at a protest is really a good note to end on, that decolonization is the only form of justice for the crimes of settler colonialism. And so that means land back, that means right of return for Palestinians, that means kinship, it means relationship building, both with the land, with plants and animals, and with other people. That means collective liberation, right? Liberation for oppressed people everywhere. And some of our other speakers will talk more about some more opportunities to get involved. And then, as Scarlett mentioned, we'll have flyers for the Snoqualmie tribe conservation event as well. Cool. And then I'll hand it off to our next speakers, Ben and Cassidy.
Great. So we're going to start on a kind of zoomed out view of the climate cost of US empire and its proxies, and then dive into the invasion of Gaza and the direct environmental consequences of the occupation. Did that work? Great. Sorry. So, too many things. So, a quick primer on climate change. A lot of you know about this, but I just want to quickly talk a little background, or a little primer. So as we know, the last 10,000 years or so, we've been able to kind of reconstruct our past climate. So if we look at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's quite stable the last 10,000 years. And then as you can see on the right, in the Industrial Revolution, we burn a bunch of fossil fuels and massively ramp up the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But as you can see, we've been emitting a huge amount of CO2 and just continually ramping up. This increases the likelihood of extreme weather, heat waves, forest fires, and sea level rise. Unfortunately, these effects are also not distributed globally. Many of the people who suffer the worst effects are folks in the global south who didn't really have as much input as the imperial core and all of their emissions in their work in industrializing. Climate change is often talked about as this, we fix it or we don't, but I think a better way to look at it is what are the possible pathways we have forward? I stole this plot from a UN IPCC report. It's showing kind of where we are currently and our future emissions pathways. All this means is, how is the globe going to react to climate change? Are we going to go up that top line and go in this very business as usual, let's dig up a bunch of coal, let's burn it, who cares? Or are we going to go in a more emissions-friendly scenario on the bottom and try to really reduce our emissions and potentially suck them out of the air? So we've known about climate change for a while, but the first global attempt to address this was in '97 with the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto is a city in Japan. This was an international agreement to try to limit global greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, the US was a key negotiator in trying to exclude global militaries from greenhouse gas emissions accounting. The US also failed to ratify this treaty in a Senate vote of 95-0. So not great support. Fast forward to 2015, we have the successor to Kyoto, the Paris Accords. Many of you have heard of these. They're a bit more expansive, like larger goals. Unfortunately, they still have this kind of opt-in mechanism. So if countries want to report their emissions for militaries, they can. But a lot of countries like the US don't do this. This is really difficult if you're trying to track global emissions and all the militaries of the world are saying, oh, we don't really want to report that. Especially when you have entities like the US military, who are the single largest institutional consumer of hydrocarbons in the world. This is because the US military is expansive across the globe, with hundreds of military bases stretching all over the world. This is so it can require or can distribute fuel for jets, ships, troops, and other infrastructure to support its aims. And the point of the talk, Israel is just a small part of US imperialism, but it's a very active part. We have a quote from former President Joe Biden speaking in 1986, and I quote, "Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region." Fortunately for Joe Biden, we do have an Israel, and we give it a lot of money. Since '71, we've given it $308 billion, and 3/4 of that has been direct military aid. That 3/4 of $308 billion has allowed for things like the 2023 Israeli invasion of Gaza. For reference, Gaza is roughly if you took a square around Seattle, Lake Washington, and Bellevue, that's about the size of the city. So it's a very small area. And in that, in 2024, Israel dropped 85,000 tons of bombs on the city and area. A study by a British medical journal, The Lancet, found that, or estimated, this could have had a death toll of 186,000 when you account for not direct deaths, but also deaths due to the failing infrastructure. Here we can see two views from satellite images at night. Gaza on the left, Gaza on the right. The difference is before and after invasion. So you can see on the left you have city lights, infrastructure. On the right, huge destruction of electricity and lights and not a lot going on. This is really difficult not just to have lights, but obviously to make civilization run. And when you have tons of casualties, it's really difficult to run hospitals. Many of the hospitals in Gaza that were not bombed have had to run on grid power cuts of 8 to 12 hours a day with very limited backup generators. In addition to these destruction of the power grid, Israel has also limited, through a blockade, fuel shipments into Gaza to run generators. Not only is this important for hospitals, but also for things such as wastewater plants and desalination plants, which is really important for dysfunctioning society. And this really contributes to the additional casualties of the occupation. I saw a study that if you were doing the climate accounting of rebuilding Gaza and destroying it, it would generate about 61 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's kind of an abstract number. So just a few different comparisons. We have, convert that, it's about 6.2 billion gallons of gas, or the yearly energy consumption of 7.4 million homes in the US. We also, in the occupation, there was also a massive amount of bombing and bulldozing, which destroyed the vegetation in Gaza. We have on the left pre-invasion, on the right post-invasion. As you can see, a massive amount of agricultural fields, olive groves, and other vegetation was destroyed. And so tying this all up, I think that if you oppose war and imperialism, that's a really key piece of climate justice. So if you're an environmentalist and you care about climate change, you should also be actively anti-war and oppose the invasion of Gaza. With that, we'll go to a more happy note with my co-presenter, Cassidy, who's really going to dive into the ecological consequences that the occupation has had on Palestine. Here you are.
A lot of things to hold.
Hi, thanks so much. So that image of the destruction of vegetation in Gaza may have come as a bit of a surprise if you, like me, have been exposed to some of the propaganda that the State of Israel puts out about itself, specifically in relation to the climate. The IDF prides itself on the fact that it has the most vegan members of any military. Tel Aviv tourism agencies market Tel Aviv as the world capital of veganism. And overall, Israel really prides itself on being a climate innovator, sort of generating technologies to allow the country to be ready for climate crisis. And this isn't a new part of the myth-making of the State of Israel, because when settlers began moving to Palestine about 110 years ago, one of the motivating principles was the concept of revivim, or making the desert bloom. This is the Negev Desert. It takes up about 2/3 of the landmass of Palestine. And part of the justification that settlers used was this concept that they were going to move to Palestine and improve the land, transform the desert into something better. And often what that meant was take the desert and turn it into agricultural fields or turn it into green forests. And there have been many massive afforestation efforts across the land of Palestine. And often these big afforestation efforts, basically they plant monocultures of one or two types of trees. In the early 20th century, a lot of the afforestation efforts were big forests of eucalyptus. That is an invasive species from Australia that is also highly flammable. Most of the state forests now are these monocultures of Aleppo pine. Aleppo pine is technically native to the region. However, its range has been vastly expanded by these afforestation efforts. Aleppo pines are big trees. They have a big overstory and they tend to shade out almost everything below, so there's very little understory plants in these forests. They also shed a ton of needles on the ground, so they fundamentally transform the landscape, and inside these artificial afforestation projects, you find much less biodiversity inside them than outside them. The habitats that have been afforested, they're fundamentally altered. These are this kind of interesting transitional habitat where a Mediterranean climate meets the Negev desert. Some of them are called shrublands, some of them are called loess steppes. But they're these unique habitats that have a lot of important endemic species, and these native species are threatened and displaced by these massive afforestation efforts. So this is just a picture of some of the just incredible, beautiful flora and fauna that you can find in Palestine in the fragments that remain. But perhaps most insidiously, these afforestation efforts, they conceal evidence of Palestinian and Bedouin displacement. There are about 70 of these national forests, and 2/3 of them are on the sites where previously a Palestinian or Bedouin village once stood. So this is a way for the state of Israel to assert their ownership over the land, conceal the efforts of genocide, conceal the evidence of genocide, and this tree planting and afforestation is ongoing, and it allows, for example, the prevention of Palestinian villages to expand. So some land, like right around the borders of a village, could be claimed as conservation land, trees could be planted all around it, and that limits the growth of the town. Another important aspect of Israel's greenwashing is the way that they handle their water infrastructure. Starting in the 1940s and 50s, the state of Israel made several massive public works projects for handling its water. They drained the Hula Valley, which is a huge wetland in the north. They drained it for agriculture. They also built huge systems of dams and aqueducts, mostly for the purpose of moving water from the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee in the east to the cities in the west, like to Tel Aviv. And in 2012, when it became clear that the climate crisis would lead to huge water issues around the globe, but especially in dry regions, Israel really ramped up investment in water infrastructure. So they built a ton of desalination plants, so taking water from the sea and making it suitable for human consumption. They also really invested in water reuse, so taking sewage and recycling it for use in their big drip irrigation systems. So this is a really big source of pride, and it is pretty impressive technology. But this is an apartheid state, and that means that none of the benefits of this technology are equally distributed. So in 1967, the state of Israel consolidated control over water rights for the whole landmass of Palestine. And Palestinians are forbidden from accessing any of the water from the Jordan River. Since the 90s, technically Palestinians have been able to dig their own wells, at least on paper, but in practice, it is extremely difficult. Sorry, how do I go back? In practice, it is extremely difficult to get a permit to dig a well. What that means is that Palestinians are dependent on buying water from the Israeli state or on relying on low-tech rainwater cisterns like the one on the left here in the West Bank. And unfortunately, what meager water resources Palestinians in the West Bank have are often under attack, both by settlers and by the military. This is an example on the left of one of those rainwater systems that was destroyed by settlers who dumped electronic waste into the well, so effectively poisoning the water for the town. And when you have limited water, that has just so many consequences for daily hydration, for hygiene and public health, and of course for agriculture as well. And I really want to emphasize that these restrictions on water do not apply to the illegal settlements in the West Bank. On the right is a swimming pool in an illegal settlement in the West Bank. So Israeli settlements have no problem getting permits to dig the wells they need. And just in general, these settlements tend to have more of a culture of kind of a consumerist Western society. So they have things like palm trees and lawns and swimming pools that need to use quite a bit of water in the middle of the desert. In Gaza, this crisis is particularly acute, and it was acute even before the war. So Gaza is extremely densely populated. The population has grown to around 2 million, and the people do not have freedom of movement. So as their population is becoming more dense, the Israeli blockade has severe restrictions on development. So in Gaza, there are rules of the Israeli blockade that say any substance that has a quote unquote dual purpose, meaning it could be used for civilian or military purposes, and that definition is just totally up to the state of Israel. They can call just about anything dual purpose. Anything that they think is dual purpose is severely restricted. So that includes construction materials like concrete and rebar. And what that means is that it's extremely difficult to build the infrastructure that is needed to support the population. So there's only one river that flows through Gaza. It's called the Wadi, and it flows from east to west. And it's been severely polluted with sewage for a long time. This is a picture on the left of the Wadi polluted with sewage. And there was an effort by Western NGOs to clean up the Wadi and build a new sewage plant. And the results of that cleanup are on the right, where basically the people in Gaza are dependent on international NGOs to convince Israel to let them import the supplies that they need to properly develop. Now, unfortunately, all of the progress that was made for this cleanup of the Wadi have been completely reversed by the war, both because of just direct destruction of infrastructure and, like Ben mentioned, the fact that the blockade makes it very difficult to import things like fuel in order to run the infrastructure that they need. So what I want to emphasize, I already talked about the way that the Israeli state engages in greenwashing, projects that seem good, but they have a hidden environmental and human cost. But also another key piece is that the oppressive occupation prevents development in Gaza and the West Bank. And when development is prevented, the environment is inherently going to be degraded, like we see here. All right, so as I said, most of the water from the Wadi, it flows from east to west to the sea, but most of it is actually diverted by a dam before it reaches Gaza. And so all of the drinking water in Gaza comes from the coastal aquifer basin, which is north. Now, unfortunately, as the population has grown, and there has been, again, no freedom of movement, the water table has dropped and the water in the aquifer has become damaged. It is brackish. Because of that, it needs to be desalinated in order to be suitable for drinking. And so again, in the context of the blockade, it's just very difficult to ever have a healthy environment when there's no freedom of movement and when development is so restricted. Now, so I've talked a lot about the way that prevention of development necessarily damages the environment, but I would also be remiss if I didn't focus on the direct environmental destruction of the occupation and of the war. This can take the form of sewage dumping. So many illegal settlements in the West Bank, they purposely settle uphill from Palestinian villages, and just untreated sewage can flow from the Israeli settlements into the Palestinian villages, just totally destroying their crops and creating public health crises. As Shelby mentioned, this can take the form of the destruction of olive groves. So since 1967, over 1 million olive trees have been destroyed. And this is a destruction, both an environmental cost and, of course, a cultural cost. It's really destroying their way of life. And then another really kind of horrifying thing that I discovered in this research is that the state of Israel engages in herbicide spraying from crop dusters into Gaza and into the West Bank. So This is a study conducted by Forensic Architecture on the right, where an Israeli plane crop duster sprayed Roundup technically just over the border, but it was on a day they did modeling of where the wind went, where basically all of the herbicide blew right over the border into Gaza and damaged a bunch of crops. And they actually followed up with the farmers and did a study of just how much damage was being done to their crops from this illegal herbicide spraying. And this is just a cause for concern, both from an agricultural perspective and a public health perspective as well. There are just so many examples of the direct environmental cost of the war that it was honestly pretty difficult to figure out what to include. But I also here's just a few things I want to mention. There are so many fires burning in Gaza due to the war, and the fires send smoke and particulates into the air, which make it quite unhealthy. And then, of course, there's the fact that when many buildings are reduced to rubble, everything that is in the building, so all those building materials, insulation, things that you don't want to be breathing in, are then just sent into the air in the form of particulates. So what I want to drive home is that to try to wrap your head around the environmental cost of the occupation in Palestine, is that I found that there tend to be three themes that emerge, and each area kind of feeds into the other. So first, there's the greenwashing that is conducted by the State of Israel, where they create these projects that sort of buy them positive international sentiment. They seem like really good ideas, but then they hide they have a hidden environmental and human cost. There's the fact that the oppressive occupation prevents development of infrastructure for Palestinians, and that inherently leads to a degraded environment. And then finally, there's the direct environmental destruction of the war. And this whole system and cycle is made possible through the political and financial support of the United States. And so if you're an American and if you're feeling upset like me that this is being done in our name and with our money, I'm just really excited to hear from the next few speakers who are going to talk about a way to resist this cycle and say, like, hey, this is not okay. Thank you.
She needs the clicker. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My talk is about my experience in the West Bank last summer. I was there 2 times, actually, for overall 7 weeks. I joined an organization, FASA, who's part now of ISM, International Solidarity Movement, that organized protective presence in the West Bank. What is protective presence? Basically, the presence of internationals make it less likely that violence will happen, violence by settlers and soldiers will happen on the ground. And that's what we were told all the time by Palestinians who want us to be there because it's making somehow a difference. When the violence happens, we are there to document it, to bring back this, to bear witness to incidents of home demolitions, attacks, etc. I met volunteers from other organizations, for example, Centers for Jewish Nonviolence and Jordan Valley Solidarity. Well, I was mainly in the town of Kusra in the north of the West Bank, but I also spent a few days in the Jordan Valley and in Masafer Yatta. I'm not going to talk about the history of Israel-Palestine. I'll just mention that Israel has encroached on Palestinian land to the point that nowadays the West Bank is often compared to Swiss cheese, where Palestinian villages are surrounded by settlements everywhere. The West Bank is pretty small. It's about the size of Delaware. I've never been there, but I hear it's the second smallest state in the United States. As a byproduct of the Oslo Accords, the West Bank is divided in area A, B, and C according to the control from Israel. But Palestinians tell me that it's pretty much the same. They feel the control of Israel everywhere. So that's Kusra. So you can see it's surrounded by mainly area C and settlements. This is a view from our guest house. So you can see olive groves, olive oil factory, farms, Palestinian farms. And you can see at the top of the hill, outposts and settlements, and they are all around, So what's the difference between the two? Settlements are illegal under Israeli law. Outposts are illegal even under, settlements are illegal under international law. Outposts are illegal even under Israeli law. But that doesn't really make much of a difference because even outposts are well supported by Israel. They are provided electricity, water, and the support of the military. As we all know, after October 7, Palestinians have experienced actually, can I? Sorry, because I need to see the slides. I'm going to see myself. Palestinians have experienced an escalation of violence. This whole land that you see here, soon after October 7, the soldiers came and forbid access to that land. So they Palestinians lost access to their olive groves, olive factories, their farms, and so you can imagine the loss to their livelihood. Soon after October 7, particularly on October 11, settlers attacked the town of Kusra. 4 young Palestinians were killed. The day after, during the funeral, the settlers attacked again and killed 2 more Palestinians. These last 2 were the brother and the nephew of Abed, our Palestinian coordinator. Those 2 were prominent activists in Kusra. They've been, working hard to advocate for human rights for their people in Kusra. So this is a playground that we were told had been closed for 3 years before we arrived because settlers and soldiers had attacked the children many times with tear gas, throwing stones. And they opened it because of us, because our presence was providing a little bit of protection for them. One day, as we were walking around Kusra, we witnessed soldiers humiliating a Palestinian man, forcing him to open his pants in front of us. Well, so this is common in Kusra, burn houses, cut down trees, olive trees, cut down or uprooted. After about 10 days we were there, we experienced our first attack. That day, we accompanied a few Palestinian farmers to their olive grove, to that land whose access was forbidden since soon after October 7, so they hadn't been there for many months. But soon after we were there, we saw some young settlers arriving with a thick wooden stick and metal pipes, and they started attacking us, started beating us. I was lucky because I was pushed down the hill, and so I got out of their way, and I was able to keep filming them. And actually, the video on CNN is my video. 3 of my friends needed medical attention. They were hurt. But despite the trauma, we actually were at least comforted by the overwhelming attention that we got from the international media. And that made me think about the Palestinians who go through this type of trauma, and actually much worse, on a daily basis, but their stories are hardly ever covered. One more thing that I want to point out, 2 of the settlers who attacked us were unmasked, and so we have clear pictures of them, but to this day, no consequences. They are still, no consequences for them. we had encountered with Israeli soldiers on a daily basis. You know, they invaded Kusra, sometimes they raided Palestinian homes. Sometimes the Shabab, you know, Palestinian youth responded with throwing stones, and then the soldiers responded with live ammunition. But actually, sometimes they use live ammunition even without a stone throwing. Abed's nephew one day was shot in the abdomen while he was entering the grocery store. Checkpoints are another tool of oppression on Palestinians. They are everywhere. You never know how long it takes to travel through the West Bank. It could be 20 minutes, an hour, several hours, the whole day. I'm going to tell you two harrowing stories that I heard from Palestinians at the checkpoints. One is from Abed's son. He's 18-year-old. One day he was arrested at a checkpoint for no reasons. He was detained for a week. That experience was so traumatic for him that he decided to abandon his dream of attending a university. And the story comes from a man in Masafer Yatta. He told us that his mom, when his mom gave birth to his brother, she needed to go to the hospital. The Israeli ambulance wouldn't transport her, and the Palestinian ambulance was stuck on the other side of the checkpoint. The baby died. She almost died too, and she had to be transported across the checkpoint with a blanket and towels. These iron gates, you find them everywhere in the West Bank. They're not just checkpoints, they're also these gates that block access to main road. Sometimes they're open, sometimes they're closed, sometimes they're open at certain time during the day. This one in particular blocks access to a main road. So when we were traveling to the nearby village, it would actually take a really long time to get there, even if we saw the village right there. As I was traveling in the West Bank, sometimes I was wondering if what I was seeing was a settlement or Palestinian villages. And then I discovered that there is one detail that tells them apart. You have to look at the rooftop of those houses. If you see water tanks on the rooftops, those are Palestinian villages. As the previous speaker told you, Palestinians are not allowed to dig their own wells. They must buy water from Israeli companies. As I said, I was a few days in Masafer Yatta in the south West Bank. Masafer Yatta is very different than Kusra. In Kusra, the houses were very beautiful, at least the one that had not been destroyed. But in Masafer Yatta, the houses were basically shacks rebuilt out of previously demolished homes. In the 80s, a large part of Masafer Yatta had been designated as a military zone. And so that gave an excuse to Israel to displace, to evict hundreds of people there, to demolish homes and erase entire villages. Residents there are not permitted to rebuild. If you saw No Other Land, the Oscar winner documentary, that one has been filmed in Masafer Yatta. So I would recommend going to see it. So here is the home demolition in Atuani that happened just a few hours before I arrived. I'm going to skip the video. This is Umar Hair was staying in Masafer Yatta. Actually, here is another difference with Kusra. In Kusra, the settlement were a few miles away from the city, from the town of Kusra. While here, the encroachment with Palestinian land is to the point that settler houses are just right there, are next door. So you can see here clear apartheid, like on one side, settler houses separated by Palestinian homes. Of course, Palestinians are not allowed on the side, but you will see, I was seeing settlers and soldiers on the Palestinian side, regularly. Well, I want to say something, I want to mention something positive out of this experience. I was impressed with the Palestinian hospitality. As we were walking around the town of Kusra, people were stopping us all the time to invite us for coffee and teas. Sometimes we had coffees like 3 or 4 times a day. And actually, one time, we heard that the soldiers had invaded Kusra, and so we were running toward the town to film the soldiers. And there was this young Palestinian girl who chased us and asked, "Do you want to come for dinner tonight?" Anyway, we were very happy to share time with the Palestinians because that was also to listen to their stories, and because that was also a way to show to them that they had not been forgotten. We were shepherding daily in Kusra to accompany a shepherd who had been shot and beaten some other times. This is an encounter with the soldiers who showed up with this military order saying that, oh, in the next 24 hours, you're not allowed to be here. You need to leave immediately. That time, actually, we didn't really leave. I mean, we left, but really, really slowly, and we basically stayed there. And I realized that even grazing the sheep is a form of resistance. We were staying in that land. I'm going to skip, actually, this. I was a few days in the Jordan Valley. I just mentioned that one night was really scary. This was one of the most scary times in the West Bank, because we were in the middle of nowhere. It was just me, another volunteer, and the Palestinian owner of this house. We were on the rooftop. In the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, soldiers came. In the end, they just came, went into the house and left. Nothing happened, but it was really scary. So you can see that they are there to intimidate you and to make your life miserable. And actually, it's very sad that a few days later, the Palestinian owner of this house made a painful decision to abandon his home and to relocate somewhere else because he couldn't take it anymore. All right, I'll talk about the protest in Beta. Every Friday in Beta, Palestinians protest against the ongoing appropriation of their land by Israeli settlers. The protests typically start with the Juma prayer, like you see here on the right. Every time I was there, I witnessed soldiers using tear gas and live ammunition. Actually, in the last 3 years, 17 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli army during the protest in Beta. Now, you all know that Aishanur Iji from Seattle was killed in one of those protests. I was there, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit the circumstances of that killing. So that day, the protest started like any other with a prayer, and it was soon followed with tear gas and live ammunition. So I remember like running down the hill with my eyes burning. We stopped in this patch of land where I remember we were there for quite a while, maybe like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I don't know, but where really seems like nothing was happening. We actually thought that maybe the protest had ended. So we were there for a long time. I remember I was chatting with our volunteers. Aishanur was next to an olive tree, next to another volunteer. And we were really far away from the soldiers, at least 200 meters. And so it came to a shock when they shot her. They shot her in the head. She was standing still. She had been there for a long time, so they really had all the time they wanted to aim at her. And it's really shameful that the Israeli forces statement, that does not take responsibility for their crimes. They said that the gunfire had not been aimed at her, but aimed at the key instigator of the riot. As a witness of their murder, together with many other witnesses, I can say that that is a big lie. There was no instigator. We were peacefully there. They had all the time they wanted to aim at her. And it's even more shameful what Biden said. Apparently, it was an accident. The bullet ricocheted off the ground. I don't know how he could say that, and I don't know if Biden realized that his statement puts in jeopardy our life, the lives of volunteers there, because it's basically telling that Israel can kill Palestinians, Americans, whoever they want, but the United States will always back them up. So, Aishanur was killed by a soldier, but she was also killed by the culture of impunity that soldiers and settlers enjoyed in that land. And that's really the tool of the state of Israel to oppress Palestinians. It's what emboldens the violence. So settlers and soldiers are really a tool of the state of Israel to keep oppressing Palestinians. And let's not forget our complicity as we keep providing the funding to that war. Palestinians have told me over and over that this is not about Jews or Judaism. It's about land grabbing and denying equal rights. And I pass it now to Case.
Does this work?
I think they need to change it.
It's not it. Great. So you've been listening for a long time, so I don't want to talk a ton, but I just will tell you a little bit about how I ended up in Palestine and working with the International Solidarity Movement. I went to Palestine for the first time in 1993, or 94 actually. It was just a year into the Oslo Accords, which were signed in 1994. The Oslo Accords were in response to the first Intifada, which began in 1987. So from 1987 through 1993, there was a campaign of mass civil resistance in Palestinian society. Every sector of Palestinian society was involved and mobilized. Many thousands of people were arrested. Like when I went to Palestine and began to meet Palestinians, like every man that I spoke to of my generation had been in prison during the first Intifada, and many of the women had become activists not really by choice, but because all the men were in prison, and so they were sort of having to pick up the activism. When I went in 1994, people were not really saying that they had very much hope for the Oslo process, but nonetheless, they had hope. Like, people knew that things weren't, there was not that much change, and people knew that there was so much wrong with the agreements and that the likelihood of them actually getting a state wasn't that great, but it felt like a victory. It was an acknowledgement of the power of their movement, and it felt like a hopeful time, even though actually our first full day there was the day that Baruch Goldstein murdered 43 Palestinians in the Ali Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. So, that was, and he was an Israeli settler in Hebron, which is probably the most contested city in Palestine. So, or the one where settlers have caused the most damage over the years. So it was very clear that there was a lot to be afraid of, that it wasn't going to be smooth going to peace, but nonetheless, people had a hope that things were going to change. By the time I went back, I next went to Palestine in 2002, and that was because the second Intifada broke out in September of 2000, after basically 7 years in which not only did they not get closer to peace, but in fact, so this slide is not accurate, actually, and I apologize for that. I sort of started to do it one way and then changed it, but the middle number should read 450,000 settlers. By the time I arrived in 2002, the number of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem had doubled from 1993. So during the whole Oslo period, as they were supposedly negotiating for the return of Palestinian lands and for Palestinian independence, the Israeli presence in the West Bank and the presence of Israeli settlers was multiplying exponentially. And moreover, Israel was constructing this network of ring roads, so that a friend of mine who grew up in a settlement in the West Bank described driving through Palestinian villages every day, to get from where her school was, like, back to the settlement. But that is no longer true. Now there's this network of roads that enable settlers to bypass Palestinian villages and go quickly from their homes in the West Bank to Israeli cities, to Tel Aviv or Shari Tikva or Jerusalem, without passing through a Palestinian village. And at least at the time that I was there, from 2002 to 2005, Palestinians were mostly not allowed on those roads except at very narrowly prescribed times, and people only had permits. Like, mostly you had to take taxis, and the taxis only had a permit for a very short stretch of road, so you might well have to change modes of transportation 2 or 3 times to get where you were going. To some extent that has changed a little bit, but only because basically the resistance represented by the Second Intifada has been completely crushed. So in September 2000, out of frustration of seeing the non-progress that the Oslo Accords represented, the Second Intifada broke out, and it was a campaign of mass civil resistance that began like the First Intifada, but the level of repression was much, much harsher. Within the first week, the Israeli government fired 1 million bullets at mainly nonviolent protesters. Many thousands of people were injured. Many more were arrested. And as an American Jew, I started to feel like it was really on me to do something. Like, people were not really, Palestine was not in the news even as much as it is now. And really people were not, the international community was not really responding. And I saw a call from the International Solidarity Movement for internationals to come and be with Palestinians as they resisted the repression. And I thought, breaking the law, that's something I know how to do. It seems like my skill set, and I felt like an obligation. I didn't really want to go, I have to say. I've never really wanted to live outside the country. I'm not great at languages. I didn't speak Arabic, but I felt like I needed to go. I ended up joining then a spin-off project of the ISM, which was called the International Women's Peace Service, which had a house in the Salfit area and worked all throughout, mostly the northern West Bank, but also to a certain extent throughout the West Bank. And I ended up staying there for off and on for about 18 months over the next 3 years. In 2005, I was deported after I was arrested late in 2004 at a demonstration against the apartheid wall, which I'll talk about in a second. And at the end of that time, I was in jail for about a month, and after that I was deported by Israel. So I kind of assumed that I would not ever be able to go back. But after October 7th, there was a renewed call for internationals to come to Palestine. ISM, which had basically dwindled over the last 20 years, but especially since COVID. Like, during the height of the COVID epidemic, nobody could get in, and so could get into the country. And so ISM kind of died out at that point, and then was starting to build up again in response to a call from Palestinians that things were really terrible in the West Bank after October 7th. And with all eyes on Gaza, no one was paying any attention, and settlers and the army were really using that as an excuse to really ramp up the grabbing of land and the consequent or the attendant violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And they asked us to start sending people again. People reached out to me and asked if I could sort of help to reinvigorate the ISM movement in the US. And so I reached out to some friends, and we started a little group, which has now grown pretty impressively over the last year. And so I was like helping to train people, I was helping to recruit people, I was helping to prepare them to go. And I felt like, from what I was hearing, it was completely different than when I was there before. And it started to feel like I had no business training people to do something that I didn't really understand at this point. And so I decided to try to go. I heard that some other people who had been denied entry or even deported had been able to get in, and I thought, well, I'll see, and at least I'll have the experience of preparing and seeing what it's like. And so I went in November, and I was able to get in, thankfully, and so I was there for about 6 weeks. And one of the first things that I noticed was how much the settlement presence had increased. And I mean, I thought it was overwhelming when I was there in the early 2000s, but I really could not believe the level of escalation of settlers. And as you see, if you remember that number should be 450,000 settlers, there's now about 700,000. So the number of settlers in the West Bank has more or less doubled, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem has more or less doubled over the last 20 years. As I say, when in 2002, right, shortly after I got there, Israel started to build the apartheid wall, which they called the separation fence or the separation barrier. And Palestinians very quickly named it the apartheid wall, and for a few reasons. I mean, one is that it's part of its goal is to enforce apartheid, which, I mean, Israel really is an apartheid state. I looked at one point at the definition of the crime of apartheid, which is an international part of a convention of the UN. And I read the definition. There's, I think, 8 points, and Palestine passes on 6 of them. So clearly it is an apartheid state. There's really no question about it. But Palestinians also really, the example of the South African resistance and the South African victory over apartheid is really important to Palestinians because, I mean, it was not that far in the past. And at that point, it had been less than 10 years and since apartheid fell. And apartheid also began in 1948, which is when the Israeli state was declared and the Nakba occurred, which expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. So the sort of connection with apartheid was very important, but I always felt like really it should be called the Manifest Destiny Wall. And that it was sort of convenient for us as Americans, to be able to talk about apartheid all the time and not talk about the fact that actually it has much more in common. What's going on there has much more in common really with what happened on this continent. And I think that it's super important as Westerners when we go there to just keep in mind that, we're settlers, to realize that we're here as settlers, most of us, nearly all of us, and we go there and we're still settlers and we're still colonists. And, we sometimes, Europeans will kind of act as if they don't have anything to do with colonization, well, I don't live on stolen land. Well, yeah, because your country colonized in a different way. But I mean, to just remember that we're all implicated is really important. How do I do this? So basically, while I was there, they started to build the wall, and the resistance to that construction was really inspiring. And that was a lot of what I was involved in when I was there before. And so, I didn't really think about it, but at that time, it was a much more hopeful time to be there. I'm not doing this right. Okay, here we go. So, I got to participate in planning demonstrations and then being in demonstrations, and it was sort of a joint resistance activity campaign, and you sort of always had I'm not doing this right. Yeah, but I keep hitting it and it's not moving. Okay. And you sort of had the experience of, I don't know. Okay. You had the experience of seeing a community united in resistance and experiencing the power of that, and then sort of sometimes you even had a victory. Some of the villages in which I participated in resistance actually succeeded in getting the wall moved off of their land. Because one of the things is that, like, if this wall were just on the internationally recognized border, the Green Line, I mean, people would have resented it, but they might not have resisted so much. But almost every inch of it is built on Palestinian land, and it has resulted in just enormous destruction of the environment. Oh, I'm not being able to move this very much. Somehow it's like, so one of the things is just that you can sort of see how it's really changed. Well, I'm not going to even bother to go there. This is my friend Munira Amar's house. Her house is completely surrounded by the wall. Their house is in a village called Masa, and it's at the very end of the village, and there's a lot of space between their house and the rest of the village. And so the army wanted to put the wall inside, like to build the wall where the rest of the village ends and before their house. And they offered them any amount of money to move. And her husband, Hani, said, I'm not moving. This is our land. This has been in my family for generations. All of their land is even further west. And so in punishment, the army built that wall so that it blocks their view, it blocks their house so that they can't see the rest of the village. And they put in this fence so they're completely surrounded. And at first they didn't even have a key to the fence, and they had to wait for the army. They would have to wait for the army to come and let them out to go, for the kids to go to school, for Hani to go work on the land. Eventually the court said that they had to give them a key, but they did not have, but they can't, just because they have the key doesn't mean that they can go in and out whenever they want. So since October 7th, they have really they have limited her ability to have visitors. So like, I wanted to come and visit, and she said, well, you have to come on Friday because that's the only day that I'm allowed to let people in. So, and Friday is like the least convenient day to try to get transportation in the West Bank because it's the Muslim Sabbath. So we had to like take a private taxi and spend a lot of money because she's not allowed to have visitors whenever she wants to. So in 2004, the kids were really kind of going nuts, being like in this prison, essentially. And so some artists that I knew were in town, and we painted this mural with the kids, which really kind of transformed their environment. But then after a few years, people felt like it didn't exactly, that it was kind of beautifying it or humanizing it in a certain way. And so they decided to paint over it. So this is what it looks like now. And my friend Allison played soccer with the kids in front of this wall, which is, sort of what they live with. So when I went back, it was during the Olive Harvest. And as Crystal said, the delegation that PwC is organizing is hoping to be there for the Olive Harvest. And the Olive Harvest is an incredibly beautiful time. Olives are very central in Palestinian culture, like the curved lines on most keffiyehs are actually representing the olive leaves. And so it's not just about economically, but culturally, the olive harvest is really central. It's a time when people work fewer hours and families really gather. And, so I was really like looking forward to it and drinking tea in the fields. But what I didn't know was that things have really deteriorated to the point that I was there at the end of the olive harvest, and pretty much every time that I went out with families to pick, we didn't get to pick. Like, we were stopped by settler violence, backed up by the army, as Elizabeth said. Every single time. I think in this situation, we managed to pick for about an hour before settlers came and said that the family didn't have a right to pick on their own land because they were within 200 meters of the settlement, which they weren't actually, and the army backed them up, and so they decided to leave. But sometimes being there for the harvest can look a lot like hanging out and having fun. And I would say, basically, people say, what is protected presence? And my answer is, it's basically presence. Like, basically, when it's being effective, you feel like you're not doing anything. And so it can be a lot of hanging out, chatting with people, learning about the land, and so we picked several days. We worked several days with these two friends in a village called Safa, preparing the land. This was post-harvest. They were sort of preparing for the next year's harvest. And they would hang out, and every day they would bring a feast for us to have after we would work for a few hours, and then we would eat in the fields, and they would bring their own olive oil and their own za'atar that they had made, and they would try to get us to say which oil we thought was better, and which za'atar we liked best. And they really showed, and Palestinians just constantly show their resilience and their determination to continue to fight for their land and to continue to till their land, cultivate their land, tend their fields as much as possible. And so on the last day that we were working with this man, he planted a new tree, a new olive tree to, which he certainly won't be there to see. When I was preparing to go, I do trainings, but for ISM, but I wanted to participate in a training and sort of be able to focus on my own, role as a participant. And at the training, we always ask people to share their hopes and fears for their time in Palestine. And my fear was always the same, was being there when someone was killed and not being able to do anything. I had been there for about 5.5 weeks. I was leaving in a few days, and I actually said to somebody, I think I might make it through without my worst fear being realized. And then one night the army came in. That night the army came into the village, and they killed this man whose name was Kutsun Rabia Darwish Hussein. And he was standing on the roof with his daughters trying to figure out basically where the army was so that they could, stay away. And he was shot by a sniper, shot in the stomach. It took him about 24 hours to die. So instead of spending my last day the way that I had planned to, sort of cleaning all my devices for crossing the border, I spent it at the funeral. And this group of girls were his nieces, and just about a month ago, one of them was shot in the head. She did survive, actually, thankfully, and it seems like we'll recover, but that was obviously super traumatic. And in general, since I left, Kusra, where we were staying, has been under constant attack. Everything that we just keep hearing is that the West Bank is just getting worse and worse. And, so I just do want to say that, people say, well, does it do any good to be there? Do you think that you're actually preventing violence? Do you think that you're having an impact? I can only say, well, Palestinians feel like it's doing good. And I mean, I was privileged to be at a number of demonstrations in Nablus and this was one of them. This was actually International Solidarity Day. And everybody wanted to take their picture, have their picture taken with us. Everybody was coming up to us and where are you from? And thank you so much for being here. Because just as Rebecca said, it's so important to them to see visually that there are people with them, that people know, so much energy goes into convincing them that no one knows and no one cares what's happening to them. And so, when I first went in 2002, I thought the point was to do things, what I was doing. And the longer that I was there, the more I have been there, the more I've realized that the important thing is just being there and just being a caring presence. And it's really like not about, sometimes people would feel like, well, we're not doing anything because the army's not coming in. Well, if the army's not coming in, if the settlers are not coming in, if you're not seeing settlers, if you're not seeing soldiers, that's the best day you're ever going to have in Palestine, and I mean, really, like, we just really need to understand that, like, the main thing that we do there is just live in solidarity with people, and whether you can do it for 2 weeks is the minimum that ISM asks people to commit after training. So like altogether, it's about 3 weeks that you would need to commit. If you have 3 weeks and you can spend that time there, it's worth it. And if you can spend longer, the longer you can stay, for sure, the more valuable the experience is for you, and the more you feel like you understand how to be effective. But, do I think it's the most important thing? No. I think that, there's so much. I mean, we always say the work is, some people say, ISM says the work is 60% at home and 40% in Palestine, but I think it's more like 80-20. I mean, most of what we do there is collect stories and information and photos like this to share when we come back. And it's really what you do with it when you come back that makes the difference. But I think it's a great way for people to deepen their connection with the work, their understanding of the issues. I felt like, even though I had spent a lot of time there, being there this time, I felt like I understood it like better. And, it's just one component. It's not like I think everybody should necessarily go, but I think that if you're thinking about it and you feel like it's something that you might be interested in, I would really encourage you to, check out there's a QR code, I think, on the flyer on your table. And, I just really encourage you to think about it, because absolutely, I would say it's my favorite thing that I've ever done in my life.
All right, thank you so much to our panel of speakers. So we're going to have a QA session now. So if you have any questions you would like to ask, please come up to the front, and you can ask any of our panel anything you like, the topic.
This is for Kate. Do you remember, the Oslo Accords were kind of a surprise. Wasn't it before that? There was a whole team of Palestinians that were going to Madrid, including Hanan Ashrawi. And then some, I don't remember, vague, but I just thought that was kind of important, that already by the time the peace negotiations went from Madrid, with kind of a majority of actually women activists that were, including Hanan Ashrawi, somehow got subverted to Oslo. But I don't remember why that happened, but it was partly why Oslo was such a flop. Thank you.
I think that's a good point. There was the Madrid conference. Yeah, I think it was a couple of years before Oslo. You'd have to look up that history, but I do, and it is kind of an interesting history, and it was partly like Clinton being in a hurry to get something on the books before he went out of office, and sorry, I think that what you're getting at, though, is the way in which the Palestinian women leadership was really pushed aside. There's a great movie called Naila and the Uprising, which is really focuses on some of the women who were really active in the First Intifada. And one of the things, as I said, like the First Intifada, many of the men were imprisoned. And so women's leadership became really, really important. And the other thing that I didn't know until I saw that movie, I didn't understand like that the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, really had outsized influence in the first Intifada. Like, they really made up a huge percentage of the leadership, and they had a lot of very strong women leaders. Hanan Ashrawi wasn't one of them. She was Fatah, and now is has her own party. But the women's leadership was really important, and I think that's why, like, the U.S. left, or like the international left, had sort of a slightly false impression of how important the PFLP was in Palestine because of that. But yeah, like, basically when Arafat came back and he brought all the Fatah people with him, and they really marginalized the PFLP and the left parties, for one thing. And so part of it was that so many of those women leaders were connected with the PFLP. And so that was one reason that the women lost a lot of influence. But the other was that, I mean, like, all the men that had been with Arafat got positions in the government, and most of the women who had been, like, holding it down in the country didn't. And so, I mean, there were exceptions, Zahira Kamal being one of them, and who became the Minister of Women's Affairs, and Hanan Ashrawi maintained influence as one of the negotiators during the Oslo process. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of marginalization. But also, I do want to say that, like, I talked to a lot of women organizers and activists, and part of it was that they were exhausted, and a lot of them had not necessarily wanted to be doing that organizing in the first place. And so a lot of them said, yeah, I, like, chose it. I wanted to, like, go sort of, you know, back to focusing on my family and being a teacher or whatever, and not be so out front.
All right, thank you so much. Okay. Here you go.
Thank you. I had a question about the environmental, like, data that you showed. I was curious, like, what your suggestions were for, like, sources or, like, great places to kind of follow to better understand the ecological issues, especially when you're wanting to share it and educate maybe those who are maybe less aware or, like, less research oriented. If there's anything like that that's, like, good for, like, a layman, that would be amazing if you could give suggestions.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. So I relied a lot from UN reports and also investigative journalism by Amnesty International. There's also this institute called Forensic Architecture that has done, they did the study about the herbicide spraying, and they actually have just a ton of really sophisticated mapping and just this kind of scientific research into the environmental destruction in Gaza. And in terms of the ecology, if you really want to dive into the ecosystem stuff, funnily enough, the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, SPNI, they're not a pro-Palestine organization. However, they have very lucid and correct scientific reporting about how bad the afforestation projects are. So they're doing conservation, and that's a really good place to start. They have actually a position paper from SPNI about the need to stop afforestation. So I'd recommend that just for that specific issue about how bad afforestation is. And then for the more human rights and public health, environmental degradation, I would say Forensic Architecture, Amnesty International, and then the UN reporting.
All right, and I just want to take this moment to remind you of our sort of calls to action. So we have, again, we have a conservation work with the Snoqualmie Tribe's Environmental and Natural Resources Department on May 17th. So if you scan this QR code, I believe there's also at the tables copies of that QR code. You can sign up for it, and you will have to sign a waiver for the Snoqualmie Tribe to volunteer. In the middle, we have a link to the sign up for the Olive Harvest Delegation. So if you're interested, after what Rebecca and Kate said, in volunteering and going over to the West Bank yourself, that is how you can get started with that. And then if you are just looking to contribute in some way, you can also donate to the Pacific Northwest Olive Harvest Delegation, just to support those who can make that commitment. And then also, again, we have some saplings available, which will also, the proceeds will also go to that cause. Good.
I'm just curious if you can talk about the environmental impacts here of U.S. military activity, because like we have all these military bases and ships and bomb manufacturers and all these things, which then go over to Israel. They're all manufactured here and based here, go to Israel. A lot of them are on indigenous land, like certain bases. And so I'm kind of curious about, like, of course, climate's global, so the destruction there releases CO2 and other toxic gases into the atmosphere, but also how the supply chain for that directly impacts the land here.
Sorry, it's kind of a big question, so we wanted to make sure we were answering it appropriately. And so I just wanted to touch on some of the, just from the indigenous point of view of, I guess, like the militarism in the United States. As I mentioned in the presentation, right, over 50 million buffalo were killed. And that actually had a huge impact on the local prairie system. It actually made the prairie more dry, and it also decreased the local wildlife because buffalo, when they're there, they do this thing where I think it's called wallowing, where they just kind of lie and kind of rub onto the earth, and it creates these little wells, and that's where, you know, water collects, and you get kind of more diverse plant life there, and that diverse plant life also houses more diverse wildlife. And so once those buffalo herds were destroyed, those very small ecosystems were also destroyed as well, but it had the bigger impact of making the prairie more overall dry. And it's also believed that kind of snowballed into the Dust Bowl, right, where there is that huge dryness and like the dust storms came in. So that's just one example, one of many examples from the indigenous point of view. But I'll hand it over to Ben and Cassidy.
Yeah, thanks for covering that, Shelby. And thanks for your question. It seems like you covered like a lot of it. I just totally agree. Like there's so much, you know, massive fuel depots here, you know, joint military bases, naval bases, and as well as tons of manufacturing for weapons that are shipped over there. So I think it's a really like key point is like, this is a great place for organizing against shipping and arming Israel. I remember seeing like, I don't know when it was, maybe a year or two ago, like a lot of people trying to like block ports and military vessels going over there. So I think this is a very good leverage point. I don't know if that helps at all, but great question, thank you. And add on.
Sorry, I had one quick one that is just kind of specific to the crop dusting image that I shared, where basically the plane was spraying glyphosate or Roundup onto crops in Gaza. And so glyphosate is produced here in the United States by Monsanto, and specifically ICL, or Israeli Chemical Limited, although I think their official name is just ICL, has a really strong partnership with Monsanto, and Monsanto actually also produces white phosphorus, basically all of the white phosphorus that's used by Israel. They produce it in St. Louis along the Mississippi River, and it is a chemical weapon that basically burns people's skin off. So yes, just yes to everything, and then I had that kind of specific example in mind that I came across in the research for this talk.
All right, do we have any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Mary. My question is probably for the ISM organizers and those that have gone on the protective presence trips. What kind of approach do you take while crossing the border with occupying Israel? Do you, for example, maybe examples of this could be which border crossing do you use, and have you found that some are slightly better to take, or for example, when they ask about your travel plans and you have to say where you're staying in the West Bank. So basically my question is kind of, do you come out and say all of what your plans are? Or do you how vague do you prefer to be while doing these? Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, so I just mentioned there are two ways to enter the West Bank. One is through Jordan and one is through Israel, Tel Aviv. Yeah, even going through Jordan, their border is controlled by Israel. I mean, I'll just say that, no, you do not say that you're going to the West Bank, right? So you kind of have to make a story. But I believe the ISM organizer prefer to, that you take the training and they actually tell you more in details, how to cross. Are we allowed to? So, I mean, the end of the story is that, yeah, you do not tell your real reasons. You make stories, maybe you find, you have to clear your electronics, and you have to clear possibly your, social media. You don't want to have your name associated with Palestine in any way, because that will decrease your likelihood that you would enter. So that's the main thing. But like when you go through the training, they will actually tell you a lot more, what to do, how to do it, and so on. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I mean, I will just say that, like, I was on a bus when you're crossing at the King Hussein Bridge, which I did from Jordan. You go through the Jordanian side, and then you get on a bus that takes you through to the other side, and then you sit for kind of a long time waiting to go to the border on the Palestine side. And there were some people on my bus that were going to a Sabeel conference, like a conference organized by Sabeel, which is a Christian Palestine solidarity organization. And they were very honest about what they were doing, and they all, as far as I know, they all got in. So, we have our approach. I mean, ISM is generally not favored by the Israeli government, and they don't want us there. And so generally, we don't recommend that anybody ever mention ISM if they want to get in. But I mean, can seem kind of random who does and doesn't have a problem. But yeah, as Rebecca said, this is something we talk about a lot in training, and it is really important. I do want to say that, like, we are really trying to slow down the preparation process and encourage people to really give yourselves enough time to be well prepared before you're doing that. Like, I think the most problems that people have are when they try to go in a hurry.
All right, thank you. So do we have any other questions? Yes. And is it possible for you to come up here? There's a cord here, so cannot bring the mic over there.
If not, we can bring a microphone so the streaming audience can hear you. But you'll just have to project your voice.
Hello, my question is for Shelby, and I'm wondering what successful land back and decolonial actions and movements you have seen in your lifetime. And feel free to think about it. Or we can ask another question as you noodle on it.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Do you know what the movie's called? Bring Them Home or something? So just off the top of my head, also to be real, my co-presenters helped me reminded me about it. But locally in Montana, I guess a pretty recent example is the Blackfeet tribe getting their buffalo herd back, and then also getting to have like complete control of that herd as well. I know my tribe has been trying, or the Ani Nation has been trying, but I know that there's kind of been some issues with the herd. I mean, because, right, borders are made up, and buffalo don't respect borders, especially white people's borders. And so they keep trampling the fences. And so I know that's been an issue in our tribe. But thankfully, the Blackfeet, it's gone a lot smoother for them. There's just, I think this year maybe, or last 2 years, there's been a movie produced about it. I think it's called Bringing Them Home or something, and it's very powerful. I kind of was sobbing throughout the whole movie, but the point of it is like land restoration and restoration of cultural connection is decolonization, right? It's revitalizing those traditional ways of life. It's relying less on the capital system imposed on us by white settlers and returning more to our relationship with the land that has always sustained us. So that's just kind of a recent example, off the top of my head.
All right, and then, yeah.
I just, for those people not able to go to Palestine, I wondered if you could talk more about the other like 80% of the work. I mean, you have a lot, but more. Like, do you work in solidarity with other orgs? How do you massify this movement and connect the question the person was talking about in terms of the militarization here, and relating that to climate and yeah, just in the context of an anti-imperialist movement, building that, especially in light of that horrendous vote in the Senate a couple of days ago. Anyway, I guess specifically I was wondering about the boycott movement. I'd like to just know more about that and know what people here can do to get more involved here. Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, I imagine probably all of us have something to say about that. You know, my feeling is, Dr. Helen Caldicott, who was a pillar of the anti-nuclear movement, one of the founders of Physicians for Social Responsibility, used to say, do whatever is in your wheelhouse, or like do what you feel comfortable with, but do it every day. And that's sort of my mantra. Like, I feel like we spend way too much of our energy trying to convince each other to do the same thing. And what we really need is, like, if any of us knew what was going to work, you know, we wouldn't be in this situation. So I feel like everybody needs to figure out what moves them, what seems right for them, and just do it. But I do think the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement can be a really powerful way to engage. There's been some victories, but not enough, I have to say. And so, I mean, like, I feel like we need to really try to think strategically and figure out, like, what leverage do we have with whom? And I mean, I've been really, I don't know if people had an opportunity to attend or watch any of the town hall or trainings that Pramila Jayapal has been doing, but I watched the one last weekend. It really made me think about, like, the pillars analysis, which I've heard plenty of times, but somehow the way that she put it, I went, oh yeah, like, who cares what we think? Like, obviously not at this moment, like, our representatives, you know, our senators, they don't care what we think. but they care what somebody thinks that will care what we think. And so, like, I feel like we have to do more of that strategic thinking of trying to think, okay, who are we? Who do we have access to that has some leverage over the people with power? And, you know, when you figure it out, please write the book.
Yeah, I mean, BDS gives me hope. Yeah, it's gonna be a longer battle, but we have the example of BDS in South Africa that was one of the tools together with the armed resistance to dismantle apartheid, and so that's really an active tool that we can use. I mean, I don't know. I would say, like, being more active in our own community, whether it is I don't know, your kids' school or your workplace and so on. I feel like there are so many I don't know, powerful forces that are against what we are trying to do. Like, for example, even in schools. So, for example, like, we all know that anti-Semitism is being used, is being weaponized and used to censor, this criticism of Israel. And we see that in schools as well. So, whatever is your community that you're at through your kids or your workplace or a church or whatever, I would say get involved. And whenever you see something that you may have an influence just because you're part of the community, speak up and get engaged with the people there. I don't know if you want to say anything else.
So I also have one of the other presenters as well, experience as a union organizer as well. And so, thank you. A successful unionization attempt, might I add. And so this certainly wasn't what I wanted to hear at the time, but as annoying as it is, organizing is mostly just having one-on-one conversations over and over again with as many people as you can in whatever community you're in. And so that's really kind of the biggest part of the work, is just talking with other people about it. And so a lot of that too is educating yourself or receiving education on how to talk about it appropriately. And then having those conversations. But it could also be like, if you're an artist, designing posters, it could be providing childcare for events, it could be being a medic at a protest or providing medical training, helping to organize things like this, contacting people. There's really as many different ways to organize as you want, kind of. It's like the other speaker said, it's finding your skill set and what you want to do and finding a place to do it. So, do you guys want to? Okay, cool. So, I think there's another question.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that I started doing this about a year ago because I came across with JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace. And before, it was just me. I've never been involved. I was participating sometimes in protests and so on. It was just me doing something by myself, which is not very effective. But once you learn that there are already organizations out there who have a history of organizing and so on, join them. And then, you don't need particular skills. You don't think that you need to be talented. Just join, and then I'm sure you will find something that suits you and where you can be effective.
Great. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet, we have a recommended reading list for if you would like to learn more about any of these topics. And we have over here at this table many of the books that are on the list. So if you're interested in learning more, take a picture of one of the lists, or you can take the list if you'd like, or talk with our volunteers over here about maybe what book would be, have what you are interested in learning. All right, yeah.
Hi, my name is Rick. I don't know a lot of the people in the room here, and I have lived in Seattle since 1969 in the central area and been an activist. And I think it's so great to see people that we don't know, don't you think? Because people are showing up now, and this is really important. And I just wanted to say that since I don't know so many of the people, especially the people who organized, that if anybody who is part of the organizing, I know June figured out how to put these lights up here. Aren't they beautiful? Yeah, yeah, and there she is back there. You know, and the people who have been up here, I was like, you know, you don't want to go to an event and it not be feeling friendly and community-wide, and having the food, the lights, the fact that the people up here were not doing what the hobos used to call getting an ear beating from before you eat. You know, you had to like listen to somebody yelling about like Jesus and stuff like that. This was not happening here tonight. You know, these people were like, thank you so much. And I just want to say, the last thing I wanted to say before really asking if people would sort of identify themselves as being the people who volunteered here and made this happen, is that I personally was really touched by so many of the care that went into the slides that went up from all of you. And just that one slide that was about the view of Gaza before and after all the destruction, the lights that were on before, the lights that are not on now, the green places that were there, that were plants that are no longer there now. Just to take like 10 seconds together of silence to send good energy to the people who are still there in Gaza, still doing such great work to hold together and move from place to place over and over again and try to keep their families together and keep healthy. 10 seconds, please. Thank you.
All right, an excellent way to wrap it up. Thank you so much. So if you're interested in any of the opportunities, please check out our tabling and check out those QR codes as well. But yeah, we are gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed.